The atmosphere inside the strategic briefing room immediately froze when the fabric of my uniform violently tore. I am Jason Miller, an officer who spent over 2 decades silently building a classified intelligence career while enduring the suffocating expectations of my military family. My father measured my worth strictly by traditional combat standards because he was a decorated Army colonel who despised anyone working behind a computer screen. When he stormed across that room to violently rip the operational badge off my chest, he shouted that I was an absolute disgrace to our family. The initial shocked silence was quickly broken by the mocking laughter of his junior officers, who eagerly watched my public humiliation. Standing completely still in the center of that hostile room, I maintained absolute silence while refusing to show the panic they desperately wanted to see. I knew exactly what was about to happen next, because the heavy footsteps echoing down the hallway belonged to someone holding ultimate authority. The heavy wooden door swung open to reveal a top-tier commander who stepped directly past my father to deliver a crisp salute aimed squarely at me. He spoke with a quiet but devastating authority, informing my father that I actually outranked everyone standing in that room. The arrogant smirk instantly vanished from my father's face as his complexion turned completely pale with shock. If you have ever been underestimated or publicly humiliated by the exact people who were supposed to protect you, tell me your story in the comments below, because you are not alone. Before I explain how I legally dismantled a toxic family legacy, please tap the like button and subscribe for more stories about setting unbreakable boundaries. Many years ago, the value of a human being inside our family home was measured strictly by the layers of mud stuck to a pair of Army combat boots. I grew up under the suffocating shadow of my father, Colonel Arthur, who commanded his household with the exact same ruthless authoritarianism he applied to his infantry battalions. Every single morning began with rigorous physical inspections and a demanding schedule designed to strip away any trace of individual thought or emotional vulnerability. He firmly believed that true military excellence could only be forged in physical ground combat, while dismissing any other form of service as weak secondary support work. This toxic environment bred fierce competition for his elusive approval, a psychological game eagerly played by my sister Sarah, who mastered the art of familial sycophancy. She quickly aligned herself with every single conservative military viewpoint he held in order to secure her own favored position within the household hierarchy. She would often mock my academic achievements by comparing them to the physical training trophies proudly displayed in his office, ensuring he always viewed me as the weaker sibling. Whenever Dad criticized the modern shifting tactics of warfare during our notoriously tense family dinners, she would immediately echo his sentiments to deliberately isolate me from the conversation. They formed an unbreakable echo chamber where physical endurance was religiously worshipped, while intellectual strategy was treated with outright suspicion and blatant disrespect. The foundational fracture in our relationship occurred the moment I officially declined an infantry commission to pursue a highly specialized career in Air Force electronic warfare. Choosing the unseen digital battlefield over traditional ground combat was treated as a direct treasonous betrayal of our supposed family legacy. The suffocating tension inside the house rapidly escalated into open hostility because my professional decision directly challenged the very core of his outdated worldview. My father viewed the emerging domain of network defense and electronic intelligence not as the inevitable future of modern warfare, but as a cowardly escape for those unwilling to face genuine physical danger. Sarah actively fueled this resentment by constantly making passive-aggressive remarks about my flawlessly clean uniform while loudly praising the gritty reality of his historical ground deployments. The absolute reality of my permanent estrangement materialized on the morning of my official military commissioning ceremony. I stood fully dressed in my crisp blue uniform while waiting near the front entryway, secretly harboring a foolish hope that he would put aside his deep prejudices for one single hour to acknowledge my hard work. Instead, my father remained stubbornly seated in his dimly lit study, refusing to even glance in my direction when I calmly informed him the vehicle was ready to leave. He coldly stated, "I will never waste my time celebrating an officer who chooses to hide safely behind a computer screen instead of bleeding in the trenches alongside real men." Sarah stood right beside his leather armchair with a visibly smug expression, clearly enjoying the devastating finality of his rejection as she silently poured his morning coffee. Walking out of that house completely alone became the defining psychological turning point of my entire adult life. The drive to the ceremony was completely silent, allowing me the necessary time to process the profound grief of losing a family that was still physically present. I finally understood, with absolute clarity, that continuously seeking validation from people firmly committed to misunderstanding me was a catastrophic waste of tactical energy. Rather than engaging in useless arguments or begging for an impossible familial acceptance, I deliberately severed my emotional dependence on their approval. Redirecting every single ounce of my focus toward mastering my chosen technological discipline quickly became an absolute obsession. Personal grievances were firmly locked away to allow me to dedicate myself entirely to the complex architecture of electronic threat neutralization and cyber defense strategies. I recognized that my ultimate psychological survival required building an intellectual fortress so impenetrable that their outdated opinions could never breach my peace of mind again. My military career began to advance quietly in the digital shadows, while they remained completely blind to the formidable silent empire I was methodically beginning to construct. 4 years after receiving my very first operational assignment, my entire personnel file was stamped strictly classified and transferred directly to the highest levels of the military command. My unique ability to dissect complex tactical data allowed me to consistently dismantle highly dangerous cyber attacks before they could cripple our national defense grid. This unprecedented success rate in electronic warfare resulted in incredibly rapid promotions that conventional officers typically take several decades to properly achieve. However, the deeply sensitive nature of my intelligence work legally required me to maintain absolute secrecy regarding my actual military rank and operational authority. I was strictly forbidden from wearing my true insignia outside of secured federal facilities or discussing my strategic operations with anyone lacking the proper security clearance. Returning home for mandatory events meant slipping back into a carefully constructed facade of a low-level analyst just to avoid breaching strict federal protocols. Navigating this massive psychological disconnect between my immense professional responsibilities and my deliberately understated family persona became an incredibly exhausting daily burden. I finally found genuine solidarity through the unwavering support of my best friend, Major Kevin, who was the only person fully aware of the crushing pressure I constantly carried. We often spent our scarce downtime discussing the immense emotional toll of having to constantly hide my hard-earned achievements from the exact people who should have been celebrating them. During one particularly difficult afternoon, following a tense phone call from home, he placed a reassuring hand firmly on my shoulder to offer some much-needed perspective. He looked directly into my eyes to deliver a profound piece of advice by firmly stating, "You do not need to prove your personal worth to people who deliberately choose to keep their eyes closed." That profound observation echoed loudly in my mind a few months later, when I was unfortunately obligated to attend a rare family gathering celebrating an Army anniversary. The expansive dining room was completely filled with decorated infantry commanders who loudly swapped exaggerated stories about their past overseas deployments while consuming expensive whiskey. During the height of the evening festivities, Dad deliberately singled me out to publicly belittle my military trajectory in front of his respected peers. He aggressively pointed his crystal glass in my direction, across the crowded table, before projecting his booming voice so that every single guest would hear his unprovoked insult. He confidently declared to the completely silent room, "Being a soldier who only knows how to type on a keyboard is absolutely no different from being a fragile academic who has never faced a real fight in his life." The humiliating echo of his derogatory statement had barely settled over the dining table when Sarah eagerly seized the opportunity to demonstrate her unquestioning loyalty to his conservative ideology. She casually leaned back in her heavily upholstered chair while flashing a viciously condescending smirk that was specifically designed to maximize my public embarrassment among the prestigious guests. Seeking to strategically amplify the blatant disrespect raining down upon me, she actively chimed in with her own malicious brand of calculated mockery to entertain the seated officers. She scoffed loudly enough for everyone in the immediate vicinity to hear before eagerly adding, "Exactly how could he possibly understand the true greatness and the genuine scent of an actual battlefield like you do, Dad?" The surrounding infantry officers immediately chuckled at her cruel remark, while eagerly watching my face to see if I would finally break under their coordinated psychological assault. They were desperately hoping to witness a pathetic emotional outburst or a weak defensive argument that would ultimately validate their deeply entrenched superiority complex regarding traditional ground combat. Completely ignoring the deafening chorus of toxic criticism swirling around my head, I consciously chose to maintain an aura of absolute composure without letting a single muscle twitch in frustration. I simply picked up my shining silverware and silently continued eating my dinner because getting dragged into their poisonous cycle of familial hostility was a massive tactical error I firmly refused to make. My profound silence during that dinner was not an admission of defeat, but rather a masterclass in psychological discipline that completely neutralized their pathetic attempts to destroy my inner peace. 6 years after enduring that remarkably suffocating family dinner, I officially occupied the highly coveted Strategic Project Approval chair deep inside the Pentagon. Operating strictly under a highly classified anonymous leadership identity, my secure desk eventually received a massive financial budget proposal originating directly from Dad's infantry unit. The heavily documented request outlined an extremely outdated tactical strategy that blatantly ignored every modern electronic warfare protocol currently utilized by advanced military forces. Reviewing the submitted operational blueprints immediately revealed several catastrophic vulnerabilities that would inevitably leave ground troops completely exposed to lethal enemy cyber countermeasures during active combat engagements. His fundamental refusal to integrate contemporary digital defense systems into the physical combat theater demonstrated an alarming level of dangerous strategic ignorance. Those severely flawed battlefield concepts belong to a forgotten era of warfare, where brute force foolishly superseded the necessity of securing digital communication networks. Adhering absolutely to uncompromising military principles, prioritizing the ultimate safety of deployed soldiers above all else, I did not hesitate to completely dismantle his flawed presentation. Protecting American lives on the battlefield heavily outweighed any lingering subconscious desires to appease the toxic patriarchal figures occupying my personal history. I confidently stamped the official rejection order across the physical documents before permanently freezing the entire funding stream allocated for his upcoming overseas campaign. This definitive administrative action officially neutralized a highly reckless military endeavor without ever attaching my actual name to the final authorization paperwork routing through the Pentagon. Sarah was currently employed as a civilian contractor within the Department of Defense, solely due to the extensive nepotistic connections historically cultivated by our overbearing father. Utilizing her unauthorized access to internal bureaucratic routing networks, she quickly traced the origin of the devastating budget denial straight back to my specific administrative division. She wasted absolutely no time initiating a highly aggressive phone call to my secure office line while completely disregarding the strict professional protocols governing military communications. She foolishly believed that her familial status granted her the absolute right to bypass federal regulations just to demand answers regarding the sudden project cancellation. The moment I lifted the heavy plastic receiver to answer the incoming transmission, her voice immediately exploded through the speaker with unhinged fury alongside bitter resentment. She was completely furious that her carefully constructed world of inherited military privilege was being directly threatened by someone she had always considered fundamentally inferior. Projecting her venomous anger through the encrypted line, she screamed loudly enough to rattle the handset by saying, "You are absolutely useless, only daring to use your cheap little authority to block his path, because you are insanely jealous of Dad's undeniable greatness." I allowed her pathetic emotional outburst to completely dissipate into the sterile air of my secure office before formulating my incredibly calculated verbal response. There was absolutely no lingering trace of familial obligation left inside my completely hardened heart to soften the impending conversational blow. Speaking with the coldest tone I could possibly muster during that incredibly tense interaction, I delivered a brutally honest assessment of their shocking operational incompetence. I firmly stated to the hysterical woman breathing heavily on the other end, "The military absolutely does not operate on the basis of blood sentiment, so if a tactical plan is complete garbage, it will be thrown directly into the trash." Right after delivering that uncompromising declaration of professional standard, I forcefully slammed the receiver down to permanently sever our deeply toxic telephonic connection. There was absolutely no remaining desire to engage in useless cyclical arguments or defend my completely justified strategic decisions to people blinded by their own arrogant ignorance. This singular decisive action permanently solidified the impenetrable psychological boundaries I had spent several long years diligently constructing against their relentless emotional manipulation. The massive emotional distance separating me from my biological family officially transformed into a permanent state of absolute mutual contempt that could never be repaired by any future apologies. The heavy silence filling my office following that severed call confirmed that I had finally eradicated the last remaining shreds of their poisonous influence over my life. Exactly 72 hours before the crucial joint military campaign commenced, I confidently stepped onto Andrews Air Force Base, functioning exclusively as the Supreme Oversight Advisor. The massive briefing room was intensely illuminated by several glowing tactical screens displaying highly classified troop movements across the projected overseas combat theater. I deliberately chose to wear a standard military uniform, specifically designed to obscure my actual command insignia, while selecting an isolated seat located in the furthest corner. Remaining completely silent within the darkened perimeter allowed me to objectively evaluate the unfolding operational presentation without drawing any unnecessary attention to my overwhelming authority. My concealed presence provided the perfect vantage point to scrutinize the systemic tactical failures being aggressively pushed upon the unsuspecting junior officers filling the crowded auditorium. Dad stood extremely proudly atop the elevated command podium while forcefully projecting his booming voice across the expansive room to dominate the entire planning session. He was passionately detailing a remarkably reckless direct infantry sweep strategy that completely bypassed every single modern security protocol established for contemporary hostile environments. His incredibly aggressive frontal assault plan blatantly ignored the massive lethal risks associated with sophisticated electronic mine systems currently protecting the targeted enemy coordinates. Pushing those highly trained elite soldiers into that heavily fortified zone without neutralizing the digital threat grid would undoubtedly result in dozens of catastrophic casualties that could easily be prevented. It became immediately apparent that his stubborn adherence to antiquated warfare methodology was going to actively slaughter his own men simply to satisfy his massive ego. Allowing that incredibly dangerous tactical briefing to continue unopposed would constitute a severe dereliction of my sworn duty to protect American military personnel from incompetent leadership. I finally decided to decisively shatter that perilous silence by standing up from my concealed position to deliver a bluntly honest professional objection across the quiet room. Projecting my voice with unwavering absolute certainty to ensure everyone heard my critical warning, I addressed his deeply flawed combat strategy directly head-on. I confidently stated, "Colonel, if you continue pushing soldiers into those coordinates without securing essential cyber support, you are leading them straight to their immediate deaths." The previously dynamic atmosphere inside the massive briefing room instantaneously froze into a chilling state of absolute suspended animation following my unprecedented public interruption. Every single pair of eyes occupying the crowded space immediately shifted away from the brightly lit tactical screens to stare directly at me in overwhelming disbelief. It was exceedingly rare for any supposedly junior officer to publicly challenge the deeply entrenched authority of a highly decorated veteran commander during an official operational briefing. The younger subordinates nervously shifted in their rigid plastic chairs while silently bracing themselves for the catastrophic explosion they knew was inevitably coming their way. Feeling his notoriously fragile ego being severely trampled in front of his loyal subordinates immediately triggered a visibly aggressive physical reaction from the wooden podium. His intensely furious eyes instantly flared with menacing red flashes of pure, unadulterated rage as he fiercely gripped the heavy edges of the elevated lectern. Unable to comprehend someone daring to question his supreme military authority, he aggressively leaned forward while glaring with absolute murderous intent across the long distance separating us. He furiously hissed through his tightly clenched teeth, "What right does a pathetic keyboard typist have to lecture me about engaging in actual warfare? Engaging in a completely pointless verbal altercation with an irrational tyrant desperately clinging to his fading relevance was an absolute waste of my valuable strategic energy." Rather than entertaining his desperate attempt to re-establish dominance through loud, aggressive intimidation, I simply raised my right hand to casually signal my assigned administrative assistant. Following my silent directive to systematically gather our classified intelligence files, I calmly sat back down in my obscure corner chair without offering any further tactical explanation to the hostile room. Remaining entirely composed under his furious glare, perfectly set the stage for the ultimate final judgment rapidly approaching when his dictatorial nature eventually crossed the unforgivable disciplinary line. As the clock hands struck 3 in the afternoon, the toxic arrogance of an Army colonel officially shattered inside the federal headquarters. Completely losing control over his fragile emotions when confronted with my unwavering composure, Dad violently shoved several heavy chairs completely out of his immediate path. He stormed directly toward my isolated position in the back row with his deeply weathered face physically twisted by an overwhelming mixture of pure rage and a profoundly wounded ego. He absolutely could not comprehend how someone he considered a pathetic administrative worker could dare to publicly humiliate his established tactical authority in front of his loyal subordinates. His heavy combat boots stomped aggressively against the polished floorboards as he closed the remaining distance separating us with clear, hostile intentions radiating from his rigid posture. Driven entirely by a desperate need to immediately reassert his crumbling dominance, he frantically reached out to physically assault my person without any hesitation. He aggressively grabbed the operational badge securely fastened to the front of my standard military uniform and viciously tore it completely off the durable fabric. His incredibly disrespectful physical action was accompanied by a deafening roar that violently pierced the stifling silence of the crowded strategic briefing room. He screamed with an unprecedented level of venomous hatred while completely disregarding the strict military decorum expected of a commanding officer. "You are the absolute disgrace of this family." The surrounding junior officers immediately erupted into nervous, mocking laughter, clearly enjoying the deeply uncomfortable spectacle of a subordinate being brutally reprimanded by their aggressive superior. The humiliating echo of his derogatory statement had barely settled over the room when the heavy reinforced doors at the main entrance suddenly swung wide open. The abrupt interruption immediately drew everyone's attention toward the doorway, where my Commander General Thomas unexpectedly stepped into the highly classified operational briefing space. He had unfortunately arrived just in time to personally witness the shocking culmination of a severe military discipline violation involving a physical assault on a fellow service member. Assessing the incredibly volatile situation with the razor-sharp instincts of a seasoned veteran, he immediately bypassed the stunned junior officers and strode directly toward the center of the conflict. His incredibly commanding presence instantly completely suffocated the pathetic, mocking laughter that had previously filled the expansive tactical planning room. General Thomas deliberately stopped directly in front of the elevated podium before slowly raising his right hand to execute a remarkably crisp military salute aimed squarely at my position. The entire room collectively held its breath as the highest-ranking official in the building openly demonstrated absolute subservience to the man who had just been violently humiliated. Maintaining his incredibly rigid posture while staring directly at the furious older man standing aggressively over me, he delivered a crushing verbal verdict that echoed with devastating authority. He stated with a quiet but incredibly terrifying absolute certainty that completely paralyzed the gathered crowd, "Sir, he actually outranks every single one of us." That single monumental declaration hit the unsuspecting audience exactly like a catastrophic thunderbolt, instantly shattering their false perception of the established military hierarchy. The previously arrogant smiles plastered across the faces of the surrounding crowd instantly vanished into thin air, immediately replaced by expressions of sheer, unadulterated terror. Dad physically stumbled backward as all the blood rapidly drained from his face, leaving his previously flushed complexion looking exactly like a sickly, pale corpse. He suddenly realized the fatal magnitude of his catastrophic mistake, having just committed a severe federal offense by physically attacking a two-star general in front of numerous military witnesses. I absolutely refused to grant the pathetic abuser even a single microsecond of opportunity to verbally justify his violently unhinged behavior or beg for an impossible leniency. Maintaining the exact same chilling composure I had held since the beginning of the briefing, I subtly signaled the armed military police stationed near the perimeter. The heavily armed security personnel immediately moved forward to secure his arms and forcefully escort the disgraced colonel entirely out of the secure military installation. Less than 24 hours following the catastrophic incident inside the strategic briefing room, the official investigation order from the military court was activated at maximum operational speed. I sat entirely alone inside the absolute silence of my secured executive office while carefully reviewing the formal disciplinary documentation sitting perfectly aligned on my mahogany desk. Without experiencing even a single microsecond of hesitation or misplaced familial sympathy, I decisively signed the official accusation report detailing the physical assault on a superior commissioned officer. My precise administrative actions strictly adhered to every single rigorous protocol established by the United States military justice system to ensure a completely flawless legal prosecution. Invoking the absolute highest levels of the Uniform Code of Military Justice, guaranteed that his deeply toxic military legacy would face permanent destruction without receiving any unauthorized leniency. The encrypted secure telephone resting near the edge of my workspace suddenly began ringing with a highly urgent priority signal that demanded immediate administrative attention. Answering the incoming transmission immediately revealed Dad speaking frantically on the other end of the secure connection, with his previously insufferable arrogance having been entirely replaced by sheer unadulterated panic. His deeply trembling voice completely lacked the booming authoritarian confidence that had historically terrorized our childhood home for several miserable decades. Desperately attempting to leverage our biological connection to salvage his rapidly disintegrating professional reputation, he pleaded pathetically through the encrypted federal communication channel. He practically begged with a completely broken vocal cadence that I had never heard before. "You absolutely cannot do this to me because this severe disciplinary action will completely destroy my entire life's career." I silently absorbed his incredibly pathetic emotional outburst while maintaining an absolutely impenetrable psychological fortress that completely shielded me from his desperate manipulative tactics. There was absolutely no lingering resentment or fiery anger fueling my calculated verbal retaliation during that incredibly defining telephonic interaction, because I had already moved far beyond those petty human emotions. Responding to his desperate begging required utilizing an incredibly bone-chilling tone that perfectly reflected the absolute zero temperature of my hardened heart. I firmly stated with uncompromising federal military authority, "Colonel, you destroyed it yourself the exact moment you violently tore that operational badge down, so I am merely executing the administrative portion of federal military law." Simultaneously realizing the apocalyptic severity of the unfolding situation, Sarah had frantically begun attempting to penetrate my secure communication channels by exploiting her various civilian contractor connections. She aggressively bombarded my administrative staff with countless desperate voicemail messages, while pathetically begging for an emergency intervention to somehow mitigate the severe legal consequences rapidly approaching our disgraced patriarch. Anticipating her incredibly predictable manipulative behavior long before she even initiated her pathetic campaign, I had already implemented highly proactive security measures across the entire federal installation. I directly issued a comprehensive operational directive instructing the heavily armed Pentagon building security forces to immediately place her civilian clearance credentials onto the permanent access blacklist. She was permanently banned from ever stepping foot inside the highly secured military facility, again effectively terminating her unearned bureaucratic privileges alongside his crumbling military empire. Every single desperate attempt to weaponize our shared bloodline for the purpose of emotional manipulation was completely shattered against the impenetrable fortified walls of military justice. They fundamentally failed to comprehend that the rigid federal legal system possessed absolutely zero capacity for sentimental forgiveness regarding the unprovoked physical assault of a two-star general. The comprehensively detailed disciplinary file containing numerous corroborated witness testimonies was officially submitted directly to the highest levels of the Pentagon command structure for immediate irrevocable prosecution. This swift administrative execution firmly sealed an unsalvageable catastrophic fate for those deeply arrogant individuals who had grown entirely too accustomed to casually trampling over everyone else in their ruthless pursuit of absolute power. Several months later, the extensive military record of a previously illustrious colonel officially closed in the absolute most humiliating disgrace imaginable. According to the final devastating verdict delivered by the federal military court, Dad was completely stripped of all his accumulated honorary military ranks and prestigious operational medals. The incredibly severe disciplinary ruling forced his immediate dishonorable discharge from active duty service, while permanently slashing the vast majority of his federal retirement pension. Stripped of the authoritative uniform he had viciously weaponized to torment his own family, he was ultimately condemned to live out the miserable remainder of his completely shattered life in deep isolation. He was forced to constantly endure the undisguised contempt radiating from his former infantry colleagues who completely abandoned him following his highly publicized court-martial. Completely losing the impenetrable protective umbrella of power previously provided by our father rapidly exposed Sarah to the harsh realities of the competitive civilian workforce. The Department of Defense swiftly terminated her highly lucrative contractor position after conducting a rigorous performance review that definitively proved her massive lack of actual professional competence. Without those completely unearned nepotistic advantages artificially propping up her inflated career trajectory, she was brutally forced to navigate an aggressively unforgiving professional landscape. Having spent her entire life maliciously tearing others down to secure her favored position, she was left to face a profoundly struggling and completely dead-end existence, entirely alone, without any genuine allies to offer assistance. Standing in incredibly sharp contrast to their spectacular dual downfall, I continued relentlessly solidifying my unshakable command position within the highest echelons of the federal cyber command structure. Wielding my immense administrative authority with absolute precision allowed me to actively protect and strategically elevate countless talented junior officers who were previously suppressed by highly toxic leadership. Cultivating a strictly merit-based military environment completely free from abusive patriarchal control successfully transformed my operational division into the most effective intelligence unit operating inside the entire Pentagon. Creating this impenetrable sanctuary for brilliant tactical minds officially became my ultimate professional legacy, definitively proving that genuine leadership relies upon lifting people up rather than violently tearing them down. The ultimate psychological test of my established emotional boundaries arrived when my encrypted mobile device received an urgent text notification indicating that Dad had fallen severely ill. The pathetic digital message desperately conveyed his dying wish to arrange a final bedside meeting so he could finally offer a heavily delayed apology for his decades of abusive behavior. Maintaining my absolute composure without experiencing even a single microscopic fraction of hesitation or lingering guilt, I simply pressed the digital deletion button to completely erase the incoming text from my screen. That beautifully silent administrative action permanently extinguished any lingering delusional hopes for a completely fake emotional reconciliation orchestrated strictly to relieve his own agonizing psychological guilt. Looking back across the incredibly turbulent path I successfully navigated, I have fully internalized a profoundly sharp truth regarding the fundamental nature of biological relationships. Sharing a biological bloodline has absolutely never served as a valid free pass to continually subject another human being to relentless emotional or physical abuse. You are under absolutely no moral obligation to blindly forgive the incredibly toxic individuals who intentionally tried to destroy you simply because they share your family name. The most brilliant and spectacular form of ultimate revenge never involves engaging in completely meaningless shouting matches with aggressively ignorant abusers. Achieving ultimate justice requires forging an unbreakable boundary of solid steel while steadily climbing to the absolute pinnacle of professional prestige without looking back. You must simply allow the exceptionally arrogant people who deeply despised you to slowly drown inside the massive suffocating pit they foolishly dug themselves. Thank you immensely for actively listening to this completely authentic narrative through to these final concluding moments. What do you genuinely think about my uncompromising decision to to permanently withhold forgiveness from my toxic abusers? And was that ultimate action incredibly cruel or fully deserved? Please share your sharpest thoughts down in the comments section below, and remember to press the subscribe button to strongly empower those brave individuals actively standing up to protect themselves.